Bienvenue, tout le monde, à la conférence de Jeffrey Alexander. On a parmi nous Mme Landreville et Mme Otougou du Consulat général des États-Unis à Montréal, qui, c'est la gracieuseté en fait, du Consulat général des États-Unis à Montréal qui nous permet d'avoir Jeffrey Alexander comme invité aujourd'hui. Donc, je vais faire une courte présentation, puis après ça, je vais passer la parole à Jeff pour sa conférence, et ensuite, il y aura une période de questions. Donc, c'est pas plus compliqué que ça. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to introduce Jeffrey Alexander, Lillian Chavinson-Sayden Professor of Sociology at Yale University, and co-director of the Center for Cultural Sociology at the same institution. Professor Alexander is certainly one of the most prominent figures of sociology in the United States today. His steady dedication to the discipline is marked by the publication of over 40 books, more than 20 single-authored, and more than over 20 others co-authored or directed, and over 100 articles, scientific articles, a quantity of works that is only matched by their quality. His contribution to the renewal of the discipline of sociology has developed over the last 40 years, with the first part of his career as professor of sociology at UCLA, starting in the late 1970s and up to the early 2000s, when he moved to Yale University. Professor Alexander's ceaseless efforts in developing the discipline has been remarkably oriented by proposing about 25 years ago a cultural sociology, now a new and vibrant current in sociology, both in the United States and internationally. Cultural sociology is presented as an overall project that reaches down to the epistemological dimension of the discipline, insisting on a post-positivist position, which I like to situate as a reflexive sociology, and up to elaborating highly significant theoretical and methodological advances in sociological analysis. This was already at work in his monumental doctoral dissertation published in a four-volume work entitled Theoretical Logic in Sociology, published in 1982-83. We'll have a glance at the results of such innovative insights in today's conference. Alexander's cultural sociology positions as a founding principle the autonomy of culture. That is to say, the capacity for culture to free itself from economic, political, and all kind of other direct constraints, while participating actively to any and all dimensions of social life. Such autonomy of culture, understood as its capacity for invention and transformation of symbols and meanings, is understood in direct response to the limitations that sociological theory had previously faced, from its classical definition and up to Talcott Parsons' latest contemporary development in the 1960s and early 70s. This basic principle of the autonomy of culture has helped Alexander to redesign the sociological project by a double hermeneutics, aiming at the reinterpretation of the sociological tradition intertwined with a new interpretation of social life. His emphasis on the political dimension of culture through the rituals and performances that are involved in the practices of mass democracy led him to define the concept of the civil sphere in an impressive nearly 800 pages book published in 2006, of which we'll hear more about today. For Alexander, the civil sphere is considered to be at the center of the organization of social life through its political institutions and practices. While the civil sphere carries the profound symbolic entrenchment of a political tradition that reaches deep down into Western political philosophy, particularly, it is also constantly reconfigured within various social movements, reforms, and expressions that are put into the active debates of our civic life. While the civil sphere is geared to a political life promoting democracy, justice, inclusion, and solidarity, it is also sensitive to the traumatic aspect of injustice touching minorities, paying attention to the modes of incorporation into the civil sphere developed through multiculturalism, as much as it concentrates to studying the iconicity of symbols that marks the aesthetics of social life in general. Recent books such as Trauma, a Social Theory, published in 2013, The Drama of Social Life, published in 2017, or What Makes a Social Crisis, The Societalization of Social Problems, 2019, are a typical example of this effort at deepening the understanding of our contemporary situation. As he analyzed the structural oppositions, sacred, profane, democratic, anti-democratic, civil, anti-civil, defining our own relations to the symbols and practices of social life, Alexander also insists on revealing the efficiency of both the representation of power and its counterpart, the power of representation. This kind of analysis is being currently developed in a series of books on the civil sphere in different international contexts, such as Latin America, Scandinavian country, India, and soon Canada. This bears witness to Jeffrey Alexander's influence in the world of sociology nowadays, as well as his international presence. Welcoming him to Montreal today for a talk on the civil sphere theory, feminism, public opinion, and party politics in the United States is a real rare privilege for which we are granted to him and to the United States General Consulate in Montreal. And without further ado, I'll just leave the mic to Jeff. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having the initiative to bring me here, Jean-François, and to the U.S. Embassy, and for helping to pay me the tremendous amount of money they're paying me to be here. And so without further ado, I want to say that this paper is written with a graduate student at Yale named Willa Sachs, who, by the way, speaks very good French. But that's not relevant to this paper. Americans characterize historical periods, it's well known, with the names of presidents. And of course, they're not the only ones. The age of Jackson, the Eisenhower era, the Reagan years, Bush 1 and 2, the Clinton decade, the Obama era. Inside the what might be called the civil religion of presidential power, citizens are swept up into ferocious, frenzied electoral campaigns, certain that the election of their heroes will transform society and make America great or whole again. Every 4 years, the fate of the world seems at stake. The focus on who assumes executive power seems merely a matter of common sense in historical terms and a matter of sophistication in theoretical ones. After all, one of the singular accomplishments of modern societies is enormously powerful states, nationwide bureaucracies headed by charismatic leaders who monopolize violence, control taxation, raise armies, and decide ultimate questions of war and peace. It is hardly surprising then that generations of sociologists and social movement scholars have focused on how power can be wrested from antagonistic states. In this talk, I want to develop a contrary position. The effective functioning of presidential power depends, I will argue, on support from power of a very different kind, what I call a civil power, whose roots are located in the collective meanings that are generated independently of the state. Social movements exercise civil power, I argue, by serving as vehicles for public concerns, giving expressions to the desires of, quote, the public, imagined as a putative whole, to which presidents are then beholden. While sociologists have long neglected the relation between policy outcomes, social movements, and public opinions, I will argue that these linkages are key agents of American democratic life. I conceptualize public opinion not as the aggregation of individual opinions within a given population, but the principal referent of a discursive or imagined community whose symbolic interests are refracted and crystallized by social movements in the civil sphere. Social theorists in the late 19th through the early 20th centuries, from Tard to Durkheim to Dewey, recognized the centrality and independent power of public opinion as a social force. Tocqueville, for instance, described public opinion as, quote, the dominant power in a democracy. Because public opinion asserts itself through elections and decrees, Tocqueville observed, in, quote, exercising executive power, the President of the United States is subject to constant and jealous scrutiny. I believe that's true. But as the 20th century unfolded, social theory became decidedly more skeptical about the independent power of public opinion in capitalist societies, and correspondingly about the possibility of democracy itself, because I think the two of them are interlinked. Habermas argued, for example, that 20th century capitalism via the culture industry had destroyed the public sphere and commodified public opinion. Mills, like Habermas, acknowledged that the independent public sphere had once existed in some golden age, but claimed that it had been buried by industrial capitalism, such that public opinion became an ideology manufactured and controlled by the power elite. Bourdieu's assertion that public opinion does not exist, quote, that's a quotation, came to be regarded as an infamously dismissive marker of this position. Critical theory's demolition job on public opinion found crucial support in Max Weber, whose work on the social as independent from the political was applied mainly to the pre-modern rather than the modern world. As rationalization proceeded, Weber insisted bureaucracy, political parties, and state power became the dominant forces. Such powerful sites of hegemony and political domination rendered the existence and influence of an autonomous public sphere a theoretical impossibility. As Weber's work gradually became metabolized, it served as a central influence on the intellectual reorientation of sociology, and political sociology in particular, in the mid to late 20th century, after which the study of public opinion and its causal role in democratic politics, quote, virtually disappeared. That quote is drawn from an article by Jeff Monza and Clem Brooks. As Monza and Brooks recount, Millsian skepticism over survey research and a newfound emphasis on the macro-structural drove political sociologists like Scotchpole and Michael Mann away from anything that smacked of cultural values, the latter seemingly fatally yoked to Parsonian functionalism. These thinkers came to conceptualize the state as an autonomous site of power unmoored from what Tilly termed the, quote, elusive realm of civil society. Political sociology concentrated instead on social forces of a much more material and structural kind. There have been some recent efforts in political sociology to move from state to, quote, polity-centered models, but they have, I think, refined rather than uprooted this version of the Weberian tradition. For example, in an ambitious volume entitled The Many Hands of the State, Morgan and Orloff draw attention to work that disaggregates and culturalizes state functions, yet they continue to equate what they call the state's unique characteristics with, quote, the distillation and concentration of power, and define the central question as, quote, how states induce or force people to obey, and assert that such, quote, sinews of power make states into, quote, the distinctively powerful governing structures of our time. I'm completely against that point of view. Social movement theory has also long neglected public opinion. To the extent that public opinion is analyzed, it's often treated as an alternative variable that competes with the direct efforts of movements to affect policy, rather than as something meaningfully related to the efforts of movements themselves. Even when public opinion is brought into play in social movement theory, what is conceptualized as decisive is what Doug McAdams calls, quote, ideational. It's not what Doug McAdams calls ideational content, but rather the ability of protest to change public opinion because they cause what he calls a breakdown in public order. However, the political impact of public opinion, I would argue, results not merely from its relationship to structural disruption, but from its role as a discursive force that is continuously constructed and reconstructed against the symbolic meta-language of the civil sphere. In other words, public opinion must be conceived as the outcome of a contest over meaning, rather than, as the majority of social movement scholars conceptualize it, as a quantifiable external force. The alternative approach that I'll take to public opinion in this lecture is grounded in something called civil society, civil sphere theory. Societies possess a civil sphere, an institutional and cultural domain that is analytically and to some degree empirically differentiated from such non-civil institutions as state, market, family, and religion. The civil sphere is grounded in a network of understandings drawn from a highly generalized symbolic system predicated on the binary classification of social groups, relations, motives, and institutions as civil or uncivil, and corresponding homologies, including rational versus irrational, open, secret, inclusive, exclusive, autonomous, dependent, deliberative, conspiratorial, egalitarian, hierarchical, and so forth. Public opinion refers to the civil and anti-civil evaluations that members of society hold about one another, about their social relationships, representative figures, and institutions. The normative reference of the public is constructed via the discourse of civil society. Civil societies have a utopian reference pointing to a solidaristic community that intertwines individual autonomy and collective obligation, in which every person is treated with equal respect and accorded equal rights. However, these normative aspirations that every individual is attributed such civil qualities as rationality, altruism, and truthfulness are never more than partially institutionalized. They are contradicted by non and often anti-civil hierarchies in other social spheres and polluted in relation to such primordial qualities as gender, race, religion, class, ethnicity, and religion. You might call these the fundamental contradictions of real existing civil spheres. And these generate strains that trigger collective efforts at civil repair, demands that core groups live up to their democratic ideals by redefining excluded groups in terms that legitimate their civil incorporation, defining them in terms of more civil criteria. Social movements for civil repair work to crystallize existing strands of public belief, naming and legitimating pre-existing social concerns, often through the creation of civil associations and organizations, which can be conceptualized as communicative institutions of the civil sphere. Social movements also work to transform various strands of public belief through the media, which is another communicative institution, by reaching out to constituencies via media outlets such as newsletters or by garnering attention in the press. Social movements also harness public opinion as a communicative force by commissioning their own public opinion polls, which is the third communicative institution of the civil sphere, and leveraging poll data in their political efforts. By translating civil concern via public opinion into political pressure, movements exercise civil power. Civil movements also exercise civil power. Social movements exercise civil power also through regulative institutions, for example, through the electoral process and through political parties. Many professional civil associations are linked to political parties, which allows social movements to channel public concerns into political campaigns and party platforms. And by engaging in voter education campaigns, by mobilizing data on voting patterns, movements can threaten electoral retaliation. And by mobilizing and transforming public opinion, they can create a potentially regulative force that constrain the ranges of action that presidents and other state actors can take. Civil associations also work social movements by getting what are called insider activists appointed to government positions. While newly elected politicians take office as president or as members of Congress, they move from the civil sphere into the state. Yet even as they wield the levers of state power, presidents and their administrations remain face to face with the movements that purport to crystallize the interests of the civil sphere. Now I'm going to turn to you can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm going to turn from theory to my two empirical cases, which are about the gradual growth of second wave feminism and its fierce struggles with two conservative presidencies, that of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And at the very end, I'll mention the most recent conservative presidency of Trump. So this is very empirical, and you'll have to imagine that it is indeed structured by the theory that I've just presented. It is, but it shouldn't be obvious. If Nixon, quote, could have his way, the syndicated columnist named Jack Anderson wrote in 1971, quote, American women would confine their activities to homemaking and forget all this talk of, quote, liberation. President Nixon's initial response to the women's movement was somewhere between patronizing neglect and open hostility. After 4 decades of abeyance, organized feminism had reemerged with vengeance only a few years earlier during John F. Kennedy's presidential tenure in the early 60s. In a half-hearted bid to placate female voters, Kennedy had created a presidential commission committed to women's legal equity. And in so doing, he unwittingly helped birth the second wave feminist movement by drawing together women activists from across the country in state-level commissions. The National Commission's major report, American Women, the publication of Betty Friedan's bombshell bestseller, The Feminine Mystique, and the formation of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, 3 years later, crystallized a silently swelling current of opinion by naming the, quote, problem that has no name, in Betty Friedan's famous phrase. This new wave, called the second wave of feminism, aimed to undo the anti-civil construction of female traits, quote, piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, which for centuries had warranted women's, quote, civil death. These are terms taken from that National Commission. By the time of Nixon's presidency, media-oriented protests from national and grassroots feminist organizations were generating increasing public support. Nixon managed to evade the demands of women in these organizations during his first year in office, yet his avowed anti-feminism would soon prove no match for the movement in the civil sphere. As polls reported that more and more women supported the goals of the women's movement, a big deal, having relatively autonomous, legitimate public opinion polling. Women's support was constructed by pollsters and leading feminists alike as emblematic of the public commitments on the part, they said, of nearly all women. Lewis Harris, one of the most famous pollsters of that day, for example, drawing from the results of his firm's 117-page public opinion study, reported that, quote, most women backed efforts to strengthen and change women's status in society, despite the interesting fact that the report itself actually reported support among women as ranging only between 36% and 48%. Quote, the news that just cries out from this welter of information, Harris wrote, was that, quote, women have sprung loose as an independent political force, a force that, quote, can never be bottled up again. So this shows the constructed nature of public opinion, which is construed on the left and the right as representing the whole of society, the civil sphere, which gives it force. One of the first indications that it changed was in the offing was the reaction to a question that a feminist journalist named Vera Glazer posed to President Nixon at just his second televised press conference. Why, she asked, had only 3 out of over 200 presidential appointments gone to women? 3 out of 200. Can we expect some more equitable recognition of women's abilities? Glazer asked Nixon, this is all televised to the nation. Or are we going to remain the lost sex? Activists from Now channeled Glazer's demand by picketing the White House in a series of widely publicized public protests. It was pretty shocking. It was, really caught people's attention. Polluting Nixon's administration as exclusive and anti-civil. Women's organizations pushed Nixon to create an independent agency to bolster women's rights and opportunities, which seemed highly unlikely given the fact that he was a right-wing politician who campaigned against feminism. But they were in a separate sphere, the civil sphere, and they tried to force him to do what they wanted. The idea was initially proposed by insider activist Representative Florence Dwyer, who argued in a letter to Nixon that the economic, social, and legal subordination of women, quote, continued to weaken our social structure and distort our system of moral principles. Nixon initially ignored the letter, but its circulation in news outlets, another communicative institution of the civil sphere, generated increasing outrage from feminist organizations. Discrimination on the basis of gender was now widely constructed in the mainstream media as a destructive intrusion into the civil sphere. And the women's movement channeled this newfound, quote, public commitment into political pressure. As Elizabeth Boyer of the Women's Equity Action League wrote to Nixon, quote, "If I assess societal attitudes correctly, a groundswell of feeling is developing which will not brook very much delay or circumlocution." So she characterizes the groundswell that's embracing all of society because the president is supposed to be completely responsive to the civil sphere and only be its representative. She goes on, "The burgeoning membership in our organization, which has expanded into nearly 20 states by word of mouth alone, certainly testifies to this groundswell." After prodding from Glaser, Dwyer, and various women's organizations, Nixon finally budged, creating a President's Task Force, capital PTF, on women's rights and responsibilities, on which the feminist journalist who had questioned him was asked to serve. The task force issued a report calling for the president's support on various women's rights initiatives. So from a different point of view, you could call this co-optation. There's massive women's movement, a call for protest, president creates a commission, then goodbye issue. But that's not exactly what happened. It's quite the opposite. Nixon, of course, was reluctant to publish the report. He dragged his feet for months, despite several of his own advisors urging him to release it. As the special counsel to the president wrote, quote, "This is a bit like the school desegregation issue. It's beginning to build up a real head of steam. I would like to see us heading the parade rather than jumping on the bandwagon after it's already down the road." Where's this head of steam? It's in the civil sphere. It's in public opinion. The president's chief of urban affairs advised him in a memo to, quote, "take creative political leadership on the matter." Okay, Nixon wrote in the margins. The matter of releasing the report became moot when Glaser leaked it to the press in April 1970. Civil pressure from the feminist movement ultimately then compelled Nixon to endorse nearly all of the report's recommendations, and 19 out of the 20 became law. In fact, Nixon eventually appointed more than 100 women to high-level administrative positions and supported a host of anti-discrimination initiatives. He signed the Higher Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibited sex-based discrimination in federally funded educational institutions, which is famously called Title IX, which has transformed women's participations in sports at all levels in the United States. It's why the US has such a great women's soccer team. No, it's true. It renewed these new laws renewed and revived Lyndon Johnson's old executive order directing federally contracted employees to submit timelines for promoting and hiring women, and gave the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights authority to investigate sex-based discrimination. These laws had tremendous consequences over the last half-century. Not that every president did them, but they set up the criteria for legal challenges, et cetera, et cetera. After the, quote, what was called the women's movement caught fire, the 92nd Congress of 1971-2 passed more women's rights bills than had all previous legislative sessions in the history of the United States, and Nixon signed all of them. Why? He hated feminism. He was forced to. by the way that the women's movement had mobilized and constructed public opinion, fundamentally changing the representations of women among at least half the population, but representing it as if everybody had changed. And because they succeeded in doing that, the power of the state in a democratic country, I'll add, it couldn't resist. This included the congressional passage of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was a vehicle through which liberal feminists disseminated their demand for the civil repair of gender relations and wanted to make it into an amendment to the United States Constitution. Contending that gender and women's, quote, difference from men was a social construction rather than a natural condition, feminists framed male domination as a, quote, sexist intrusion. Sexist follows racist, into the democratic promise of civic equality. Nixon was personally lukewarm and politically evasive about the ERA. Activists from a host of groups, including the National Women's Party, the National Federation of Business and Professional Women, pressured him, channeling public support via letters, petitions, telegrams, protests, lobbying efforts. Members of the Citizens Advisory Council on the Status of Women, in a memorandum to Nixon, claimed that only, quote, a small number of backwards thinking women with anti-democratic commitments, as compared to, quote, most women today, opposed the ERA. Heeding the activists' warnings that failing to support the ERA would cost him his re-election, Nixon finally endorsed the ERA, which passed Congress in 1972 with overwhelming majorities, only for it to be defeated in the constitutional process, which required 2/3 of state assemblies to pass it. During that same year, as Nixon launched his re-election campaign, the women's movement managed for the first time to significantly affect the political platforms of the two parties, signaling a pivot toward what would soon become a close fusion between mainstream feminism and electoral politics. In 1971, a group of leading feminist activists, including Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique, Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, Shirley Chisholm, formed the National Women's Political Caucus. Even as Nixon privately mocked the newly formed caucus in conversations with his top advisors, the NWPC warned, Mr. Nixon is going to find out in 1972 that women will no longer let themselves be consigned to the sidelines of political power, reminding the president that they spoke, quote, on behalf of the majority. Publicly, Nixon didn't want to be seen as taking their concerns lightly, however. Republican Party strategists sensed that feminism represented, quote, a powerful source of change in the United States electorate, and that such groups as the NWPC served as envoys for this change. Both party platforms had been virtually silent on women's issues in 1968. But in 1972, both featured lengthy sections on women's equity, in large part due to the efforts of the NWPC. Now, it goes without saying Nixon was no feminist. But it was during Nixon's presidency and with his grudging cooperation that the second wave feminist movement became a, quote, powerful force to reckon with, according to a leading historian, vis-a-vis state power. As Newsweek ironically observed in 1972, the person in Washington who has done the most for the women's movement, may be Richard Nixon. Just as all three branches of government had become receptive to the second wave feminist movement, the cultural efflorescence and institutional codification of its goals triggered an immense anti-feminist counter-movement. During Gerald Ford's brief presidential tenure following Nixon's impeachment, the GOP, which is the Republican Party, perceived the anti-feminist sentiments of a nascent religious right as representing simply a fringe element of public opinion. But by the time of Jimmy Carter's presidential bid, he succeeded Ford in 1976. A newly ascendant religious and cultural conservatism, which was in some large part a backlash against the victories of feminism, as against the victories of African Americans earlier, began to forcefully reshape the contours of presidential politics. A focal point of mobilization for the counter-movement was the ERA, prompting conservative religious women to create their own organizations to defeat the ERA. A woman named Phyllis Schlafly was by far the most famous and powerful leader of the anti-feminist counter-movement. There's a great, I think it's an HBO miniseries about her, played by a very famous actress, I've forgotten her name, but about a year or two ago. Tapping into simmering cultural resentment against feminism, Schlafly connected with social conservatives across the nation through a newsletter and televised debates with feminists. The anti-ERA movement drew in fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Protestants, Roman Catholics, and Mormons. Schlafly's anti-feminist backlash movement, in fact, defeated the ERA. In doing so, it gave a public voice to the growing reservoir of cultural resentment, which at the time was called the silent majority. The Republican Party shifted from a moderate to a radical form of conservatism, a new right that channeled this public resentment into a political resource and set the stage for the Reagan Revolution, so-called, in 1980. Reagan forged what would become an enduring connection between the GOP, the quote, pro-family movement, and the religious right. The 1980 Republican presidential platform, for example, included support for a human life amendment that would prohibit abortion, and for the first time since 1940, failed to endorse an equal rights amendment. Throughout his presidency, Reagan used the bully pulpit to advance anti-feminist politics, including restricting abortion access and funding, appointing outspoken opponents of abortion to the Supreme Court, cutting social programs that benefited single mothers and poor minority women, and defunding federal agencies designed to support women and minorities. Yet, while pro-family activists would have the upper hand in many public policy battles through the 1980s, feminist activists competed on equal terms with social conservatives in the court of public opinion. For instance, public opinion polls consistently indicated that only about 20% of all Americans supported a complete ban on abortion. And abortion rights activists referenced this opinion data in protest events and lobbying efforts, just as, by the way, they are doing today. Fearing that a strong commitment to banning abortion would alienate millions of voters, presidential advisors warned Reagan to allow Congress and the states to take the lead in banning it, which is just what's happening today in the congressional election, where because of the strength of public opinion supporting abortion, political advisors are suggesting that Republican candidates should withdraw support in an ostensive way. The fact that feminists were able to sustain such influence demonstrates that the revivified cultural conservatism of the American electorate coexisted with a widespread acceptance of liberal feminism, with the idea that women were indeed fully civil individuals. Of course, debates erupted between liberal and conservative women activists about what the contours of civil inclusion would look like, but the conservatives no longer would suggest that women didn't deserve full inclusion, especially for them emphasizing the rights of women to work, to start businesses, to have loans, etc. A key terrain of this debate among organized feminists, pro-family activists, and moderate Republican women activists was what came to be called the gender gap in public opinion, and this will be the last empirical section I'll present to you today. It's extremely interesting because there never really was a gender gap, but it became a very, very important collective representation in the civil sphere. Facing what they viewed as the dangers in the Reagan administration, organized feminists triggered a public outcry that transformed the president's anti-feminist agenda into a political asset for Democrats and feminists. Analyzing poll data from the 1980 election, now National Organization for Women Activists identified a gender discrepancy in voting patterns in which more men than women voted for Reagan, 54 to 46%. And they heralded this disparity as a newly emerging women's voting bloc, now coined the 8% difference as the gender gap, which created a new symbolic representation in the civil sphere. The thing was that such a gendered reading of polling data wasn't necessarily evident at first glance, since women's votes in the 1980 election were nearly perfectly split, in fact, between both candidates, 45% for Carter, 46% for Reagan. In other words, the gender gap had to be discovered and created before it could become politically consequential. It didn't exist in a material way. It had to be symbolically created as a force for a feminist public movement. Public opinion could not exert an independent influence without first being crystallized by activists in the civil sphere and then filtered through communicative institutions. And in fact, now launched a massive media campaign designed to publicize the gender gap. It commissioned its own public opinion polls and circulated them in newspapers, at Democratic National Committee meetings, and in its books. Prominent liberal feminists argued that the gender gap reflected Reagan's low approval ratings among women, which wasn't true, unfortunately, which resulted from his hostility, they said, to the ERA, to abortion rights, and women's legal equality. Scholars and political analysts now agree, however, that the root causes of the gender gap were not, in fact, tied to specifically feminist issues, which men and women equally supported. At the time, however, the media were very receptive to the feminist construction and interpretation of public opinion. And exhortations about the gender gap helped brand the Reagan administration as anti-feminist. I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff where I talk in more detail about the gender gap, but I think the point has been made. And so in conclusion, I'd like to say that transforming, quote, public concern into political pressure on presidents has occupied the attention of a lot of other social movements besides feminism. Gay rights activists, for instance, launched a campaign to increase public support for gay marriage, and after presenting poll data to Barack Obama's top advisors, they convinced Obama to publicly throw support behind same-sex marriage. A few years later, during the Trump presidency, the Me Too movement rode a wave of public indignation to create massive cultural and organizational change in the United States. That Donald Trump, the most misogynist president in modern American history, was powerless to oppose. Trump said hardly anything against the Me Too movement. He was too afraid to do that, given the intense mobilization in the civil sphere of public opinion. Yet, while Trump could do nothing against Me Too, he did make full use of his legal administrative power to appoint enough right-wing, religiously conservative, and anti-feminist judges to the Supreme Court, which led to the overturning of federal support for the right to abortion. Once again, however, the power of the presidency, of presidential power, is being dwarfed by public opinion, I would contend. In the run-up to this November's congressional elections, we are witnessing a feminist backlash that is driving political independence and Republican moderates away from supporting the Republican Party candidates, which is why the Democrats may well pull off an extraordinary political surprise in November. Thank you.
Okay, d'accord. Merci. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your talk that sort of show to some extent the strength of the conceptualization of the civil sphere that you're putting forward. And that introduces us also to some political dynamics at work in US society. We have a bit of time for questions, so I can go with the mic. Oh, there's a mic over there. Okay. So, oui. The question can be either in French or English. It's all right. Like we can. Oui.
Ce qui est arrivé au Kansas récemment, le référendum, qui a un peu turné, comment je peux dire, turn off the intention of the state government to turn off abortion right. Do you think it's a kind of representation of the power of public opinion?
No, I think that it's the Supreme Court's decision to take away the federal guarantee of abortion rights, which means that it turned it back to the states, right? I mean, this is a common thing in the United States. Individual states, Supreme Courts, and legislatures, what is in their control as compared to what's not in their control, which is supposedly a right guaranteed by the nation itself. So Roe v. Wade, back in the 70s, made abortion a right of all American citizens. And what the recent Supreme Court decision did was say it isn't a right of all citizens. States have the right to make their own abortion laws. But But in fact, this doesn't correspond with public opinion in the United States. It's more, the vast majority of American men and women support some version of the right to abortion. So it's this contradiction between the Supreme Court's decision and the independent public opinion, which has mobilized women's groups and other groups in the last few months. And for example, the registration to vote, which in the United States, I don't know in Canada, you have to register to vote, has gone like this for women. And in many conservative states, Republicans, for example, Kansas, Republicans supporting anti-abortion have lost. But I do think, why was this decision made? It comes out of the backlash. It comes from Phyllis Schlafly, the organized counter-movement against feminism that started more than 50 years ago. And it produced presidents. And my argument is that Trump, well, just look at this. Trump was powerless to stop one of the most radical and effective feminist movements in history, the Me Too movement. Couldn't do anything. But he could appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court, because nobody could stop that. I mean, they had to be approved, but, and they almost weren't. So I wanted to argue that that shows the kind of point I'm making in this paper, and that the issue of abortion isn't settled in the civil sphere. In fact, it's very unsettled. And that explains a lot of the political turbulence that we're seeing now in the electoral process of the United States.
But is it then possible that this kind of dynamics is fracturing the national public opinion?
National public opinion is always fractured. I mean, it's you know, there's...
But making it even impossible to...
Even more fractured, you mean?
Well, yeah.
I mean, I think one of the fascinating dynamics of the civil sphere and public opinion is that there's always an effort to say society thinks this. Now society thinks that. We, the American people, we, the French Canadians, we, the Canadians, we think this. Because the principle of the civil sphere is solidarity, as if there's a society that shares a moral obligation. Problem is that moral obligation is at a fairly generalized level, and it's refracted by ideology of left and right, for example. So the key question is really, what's the relationship between the ideological refractions of the generalized moral commitments that bind society together? Is there a relationship? If there isn't, we'll fall apart, move into civil war, separation, whatever. If there is a connection, then during political crises or different kinds of events, there can be a return for a moment to this sense of sharedness, commitments. I mean, it's the kind of thing we're seeing with the death of Queen Elizabeth. There's obviously some shared commitments that British people have that are not political, that aren't left or right. At least that's the impression that seems to be coming out. That Scottish people want to withdraw from Britain, but they felt that she was their queen, etc.
So when former President Trump was elected, there was the Women's March. But at the time, the movement was already kind of fracturing from the inside. And there was an article in the New York Times, I think this weekend, that said that Russian disinformation tried to fracture the movement and kind of helped do this. How do you take into account like external actors moving into this and fracturing public opinion in general as well.
Well, yeah, that was a fascinating example of journalism and frightening. But as that article said, I mean, we inside society create our own outsiders. And then actual foreign countries, let's say, or ideological enemies, they try, of course, to take advantage and to add on to and exacerbate these internally generated problems. But if the divisions in society are tempered by shared commitments to an overarching civil sphere, then it doesn't matter what foreign countries, do. And, I guess Americans are very concerned that there are not these shared commitments, but I'm fairly convinced that there are, as evidenced by the fact that Trump was defeated and by the fact that a number of election officials refused bribery and threats against them to count the votes fairly, not to cheat, because of their office obligations to the civil sphere rather than to ideology. And that's what the extreme right-wing movement is afraid of. They want to undermine generalized commitments to civil principles and to civil institutions. Journalism being another one, so they create their own fictional media like Fox News and dispute and challenge professional journalism, which is very widely practiced in the United States, as it is here, of course. Even the front section of the Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal is a professional journalism. It's only the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal that are right-wing nutcases.
You talked about the power of the civil sphere in front of facing the president and the executive branch, but what about in front of the Supreme Court and the judicial branch? It doesn't have the same power. They don't have to. They're not elected. They don't have the same. They're elected for their whole life. So it contrasts very much with the example that you're putting forth. I'm wondering what's the power of the civil sphere.
It's a good, very sharp question. There's three regulative institutions of the civil sphere in my theory, which is, one is the power of office, which I've described. Another is the electoral system. And the third is law. All of these mediate between the civil sphere and political force in the state. In other words, they control the state. Or they, in principle, in a democratic society, control the state. The thing is that the law gains its relationship to universalistic civil principles by being independent of public opinion and independent even of voting. So these are some of the contradictions. The civil sphere isn't as seamless, is filled with strains and contradictions. And this is one of them. And the US carries this to an extreme that few other countries do by making only the Supreme Court justices, I believe, in office for life. Now, of course, to be fair, this has often worked for the last really 50 years in favor of liberals. Because since Nixon appointed his first conservative justices, they've could have easily overturned everything from the African American civil rights movement, the feminist movement, gay rights movement, et cetera, but they've gradually been co-opted into the kind of civil center of the Supreme Court, the traditions of the court as representing the principles of the civil sphere, et cetera. But gradually that's been eroded, and now we have this situation. So that raises the question, really, of what power does the civil sphere and social movements have vis-a-vis a Supreme Court which seems bent on defying public opinion. Now, a lot of people have argued that Supreme Court doesn't ignore public opinion just because it legally isn't required to. And a lot of studies have shown that the Supreme Court is swayed over periods of time. For example, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the very progressive president of the 30s, the Supreme Court shot down all of his progressive social legislation for the first several years of his administration. So he threatened to destroy the court, in effect. And public opinion was so adamant against the court that gradually the court just, they got one new member, but they completely changed their position and accepted all the legislation. Now, I don't think that will happen today, but we'll see. I mean, the Supreme Court could be changed in the United States. There's many proposals. But in addition, the most populous states in the United States, of course, will maintain the right to abortion. So, you know, the whole west coast of the United States, the whole middle west of the United States, and the whole east coast of the United States, which means in principle that there are many places you can have an abortion. The problem is, how will poor and minority women get to those states? But there are prospects for that. We're going down a rabbit hole here, but abortion pills, prescriptions for self-medicated abortions are now being expansively advertised, and there are many possibilities for this. I mean, it's a very bad situation, but the Supreme Court, because of the regulative institution of law, does have and should have a lot of independence. I don't think we want law to be simply the same as a political election or a public opinion poll, but on the other hand, that introduces some real problems.
Okay. My name is Miriam. Thank you to be here and share your expertise and everything. I'm usually shy to speak with a lot of people, but I try to be concise and everything. So I wanted to go back to what you said at your conclusion, saying that transforming social movement to political matters, and add something from what you just said right now about law. So I'm currently studying in law also, so the law program here, and there is a new course here named, so in French it's Les approches queer du droit. In English will be the queer approaches of law. And in this course, particularly, there was a question that was emerged or something. I don't know if we talked about it a bit, but not too much. But I wanted to know your point of view regarding this question. But before that, maybe I will just introduce the idea where I'm going with that. So starting with the concept of human rights, when we say human rights, we say the rights of everyone. But we see that throughout the years, we, as a society, we see that the social movement tend to want to recognize different part of groups of the society. For example, the group marginalisés, the marginal group. You said that for the women's, for the women and for the racial groups and everything like that. So as we see that human rights is not enough to include everyone, now we have the new approach. with starting with the recognition of the gay, I will say the gay movement at first, and then they include the lesbian movement, and then for now it's like LGBT, and now we add LGBT plus 2 I don't know, we keep adding words to try to include everyone in the consideration of rights for everyone, so the basic of human rights. So with my question here, it was something I was wondering during my course, and I know it's important to name things, to make them recognize in a certain way, and surtout, so how do you say surtout? But, mainly, thank you, I have the word in French. So mainly in law, because in law it tends to want to categorize everything to be able to, how do you say, recognize the right, or recognize what is applicable in this kind of situation. So we tend to categorize, but the thing is, there is such a development of new words and including of this and that and plus 2, 1, 2, 3, I don't know. So is categorizing or naming things and put them in certain, is naming things not a way to, yes, include, because we recognize that a thing exists and it's important to recognize, but is it not more something that restricts in some way? So the fact that now we say LGBT, we start with gay and lesbian, and then now we say LGBT, and now we say LGBT plus Q, 3 little dots. Where are we going with that? And do you have a certain point of view in that kind of field here? I don't know if it was
I mean,
well, yeah.
I consider, that naming isn't just because lawyers like concepts, but it's a form of crystallization of cultural shifts in the civil sphere. So naming something a name is a symbol. It concretizes diffuse collective sentiments. Once you have the symbol, you can mobilize more effectively around the symbol to create solidarity and to pollute. That symbol becomes sacred, if you want, and then you can symbolize its enemies and mobilize against them. So I think that the movement towards, first in the United States, you first had black movements for incorporation, and then you had gendered movements. And that's the same order that occurred in the middle of the 19th century with abolitionism leading to the first wave of feminism. But then this incredible thing happened that I think when you open up the gates of the civil sphere in an intensely energetic and symbolized manner, it keeps going until backlashes form so powerfully that they stop them, and then it dies down for a while, and then it will start up again. As long as there's a relatively autonomous civil sphere, meaning democracy to some degree or another. That's why backlash movements, if they're not stopped eventually, lead to dictatorships, arrests, murder, and imprisonment to stop these movements of liberation and incorporation. In this case, the movement towards gay, lesbian, bi, queer, and trans is a fantastic movement, and it's an example of how the civil sphere, because of activism and symbolic performances in the civil sphere, symbolic performances of rights, of the quality of civility, it creates a re-representation, and groups demand that they be looked on in terms of the positive side of the civil binaries. We are human beings too, right? And in the same way, then human beings, the category human being or human right becomes expanded which is extremely interesting because we never know how far that will go. I mean, nobody ever thought that there would be, in fact, a gay movement that would extend feminism. Nobody even thought that there would be a feminist movement. And look at all of you here. I mean, this is a remarkable capacity when a civil sphere with a utopian core, which of course is also binary, is allowed to self-organize itself. Now, but the problem is that there are always backlash movements against such what I would call frontlash movements. And so we are so concerned as political actors with the dangers of backlash movements that we never stop to congratulate our society in a way on allowing these kinds of movements to not just to come up, but to institutionalize in law. For example, anti-discrimination lawsuits, you know, they're massive. There's millions of these lawsuits. So that the core of society has changed. It doesn't mean it can't change back. Because this is society, it's not like a rock or some material substance.
Yes, over there, at the back there.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I want to know if there is a hierarchy for the civil sphere. Is it space within the civil sphere for movement that question liberal democracy? Like I'm thinking about like radical movement like Black Panthers during the 70s, or the civil sphere is only a way of bringing those radical movements to liberal democracy point of view?
I mean, the civil sphere isn't a thing. It's a subjectivity. It has institutions, but they are also based on subjectivity too. So that in principle, the civil sphere can be radicalized as well as fascicized. And then if it's fascicized, it becomes something other than a civil sphere. Something maybe an anti-civil sphere, an uncivil sphere, a primordial sphere based on ethnic, racial, religious, and gender criteria. Something like The Handmaid's Tale, you know, that dystopic TV series is an interesting example, I mean, interesting, frightening example of a non-civil sphere which is a lot like Nazism was. How radical, so can the civil sphere be radicalized and become, let's say, a left-wing civil sphere? In principle, yes, of course. But that would require persuading a lot of people that that left wing is an expression of the core values of the civil sphere. In other words, it can't be done through political violence or through, force, let's say. But it can be done in principle. And I suppose if you looked at a social democratic state like the Nordic nations today, while they're not paradises of workers' paradises, they would be considered very radical if you looked at them from the period of England in the heyday of industrial capitalism in 1850. And I would argue that women's equality is one of the most radical possibilities in history, that it's just as radical as socialism. So in that sense, I would say the civil sphere, it has been radicalized very substantially. I'd say that also about race, say that also about gay. But nothing's ever stopped and nothing's ever done because we don't know what the utopian possibilities are in this civil sphere. Maybe someday it will be decided, quote unquote, that all companies should be run by the workers, and that workers' democracy in the workplace is the only way to institutionalize the promises of the civil sphere. And that I look at the boundaries between civil and non-civil institutions. In this case, let's say the civil sphere and the market sphere, or the economy. And where that, what is thought to be at any given time a destructive intrusion of the economy into the civil sphere. Patriarchy is now thought of as such. It used to be that patriarchy was thought of as the effectuation of the civil sphere in the family, because the all-powerful male represented God and represented law, etc. Now that's completely reversed. It could come to pass someday that people would think that having one person with wealth decide things in a company is insulting to the ideals of the civil sphere, and you could see a different form of economic organization.
We might have time for a couple of more questions. I have two here, and we'll see after that where we are in terms of time.
So should we define backlash movements as the ones that don't want to win over public opinion but try to act in other ways?
No, I know how you could conclude that from what I said, but I had to cut out a significant section from this paper, which will be published in a journal called Culture Sociology. No, conservative backlash movements also have to fight for public opinion. They have to represent themselves as working on behalf of a civil sphere, and they describe feminism as anti-civil. And they describe the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, as a dictatorship from the state. In fact, conservative backlash movements in the United States, they often redescribe progressive reforms as dictatorships, as anti-liberty, as anti-democratic dangers. So no, conservatism and backlash movements, frontlash and backlash, fight over who is capable of representing the civil sphere.
Is the limit here can be considered as crossing through like threat and violence, which would undermine the very possibility of a civil sphere? There's another question right there, but I just...
Yeah, well, sometimes...
While the mic was going from one person to the other...
Sometimes violence is a very complicated issue for civil spheres. So it's the opposite of civility, violence and murder. And usually, as in the case of the Black Panthers, for example, groups that try to introduce violence as a political campaign it's easy for left or right to delegitimate them. But then the question is, what is violence? That is open to symbolic contestation. Are guns in the United States violence? No, not in the United States. They're a form of individual liberty, right? Okay. So, but in fact, there's, for example, a former student of mine, now retired, has shown in a really interesting work that the IRA violence in Northern Ireland was conceived by the Catholic minority as civil, because it was targeted only against British officials and Northern Irish people who cooperated with the colonial, or as they considered, imperial administration. And gradually, it had the effect of transforming the IRA into a the most powerful civil party and representation in Northern Ireland. So violence is a complicated issue.
Hi. It would seem to me from what you've said about the Nixon administration and the difference when it came to Reagan about 10 years later would be the use of wedge politics, basically weaponizing indifference or contempt or hatred against minority groups, which had probably been done in the past before, but was a strategy that was pretty overt, known as the silent majority for Reagan, and it's still in use today. It's at play here for the Quebec election that's taking place right now regarding immigration. So my question would be, what would be the antidote to wedge politics used by normally right-leaning politicians to slow progress down?
Well, I mean, wedge politics is a political strategy, but it's also a form of symbolic action in the civil sphere to pollute progressive, minority, other kinds of actors, right? So the response to it could be, for example, to emphasize broad forms of solidarity. I mean, that's what, let's say, progressive forces do, to point to symbols of civil heroes who are members of minorities, to point to generals who are from despised ethnic groups, to war heroes, to all sorts of things. I mean, so I think that the left becomes really demoralized and feels overwhelmed by the fact that moral and progressive causes are wedged out in many elections. But that's not permanent. You know, everybody feels depressed, but, you know, I've been through a lot of losing things in my life, but usually there's a swing backward if there's a democracy. The question is whether a swing to the right will just stick on the right and will destroy the possibility of coming back to the left. That's the question that you're not facing here, but we are facing in the United States.
If I can tell you a little bit about the current situation, basically there's an election in 2 weeks' time, and the right is going to win, like polls say 99% of chances that they're going to be majority, that they're going to make up a majority. So what you're saying is to let them or accept that they're
I'm saying that the right isn't the same as an anti-democratic fascist movement. That's what you're fortunate in that respect. We are wondering about that in the United States. And as you can see in the United States, an attempt to separate anti-Trump Republicans like Liz Cheney, who was head of the January 6th committee, who's very right-wing in her ideology, from people like Trump who are anti-democratic and not only right-wing. That's a critical distinction.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your talk and responses. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Merci. Merci en particulier au Consulat général des États-Unis pour le support dans l'organisation, l'aide, en fait, logistique pour l'organisation de ça. Et n'oubliez pas...